Hey, good morning, and thank you again for joining me here. Hope you were enjoying some of that Promise Keeper worship. That music, Promise Keepers itself, takes me back several years to some wonderful experiences that I got to have in some stadium worship. I want to remind you that next Sunday, June 21st, we are going to be reopening our church property here for worship. We are going to meet in the courtyard. We had a group of people here yesterday morning, spacing out the areas where we can sit, getting some new sound system set up for the outdoors. So thanks to them. And if you are able to come and be here with us, we look forward to seeing you. We also know that some of you are not ready to do that. We get it. Please don't worry about that, and we will continue to support you. We hope you will continue to support the people who come here. Want to remind you that we will continue to do our online worship. We will always be doing that from here on out, I expect. We have been going through the life of Joseph in the book of Genesis. That's kind of been our series of focus here for the last handful of weeks. And I think that we need to put that on hold for this morning because we need to talk about what is going on racially in our communities and in our nation, and also what's going on racially within inside of our very own hearts. I am not an expert on race relations. I am also not ignorant about those issues. I don't speak for the white race. I certainly don't speak for the black race or any races for that matter. But I do believe that God speaks to us through his Spirit and through his word. And I believe that history and many, many voices, some that we may not have either heard or have just simply ignored, are trying to speak to us as well. But this morning, as we get going, I'd like us to listen to a very familiar voice.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. That one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
Wish that guy was still around. That is arguably his most famous speech, with pretty much his most famous line, right? I wanted to show you a book that I got several years ago called Bus Ride to Justice, and it's by a guy named Fred Gray. And we brought him to the University of Washington when I was a campus minister in Seattle. He was an attorney for Rosa Parks and the Civil Rights Movement. He is also a preacher and an elder at a church in Alabama. And inside, he signed the book, said, "Keep the dream alive." So how are we doing with Dr. King's dream? As you watch the news, it doesn't look so great, right? The dream still seems like a dream deferred to not a few people. Now, we might answer that question differently if we were answering for just ourselves as opposed to answering for our race or our nation, right? But as we do look around us, we have to wonder just really how well are we doing with keeping the dream alive? And yes, on the one hand, there has certainly been noticeable progress made over the years. Some good legislation has been enacted. That 13th Amendment was a good thing. The Voting Rights Act was a good thing. Maybe even some office diversity training has helped. Maybe. But these racial tensions seem to keep coming up. Well, us here in the U.S., we're not the only ones who have dealt with this. If we went back and looked at the world of the Bible, the tensions that existed between Jews and Gentiles, we would see that it could really be fierce. Jews being the descendants of Jacob, the tribes of Israel, and Gentiles being pretty much everybody else. And I expect that they had people on a continuum, kind of like us now in 2020 United States. Some had absolute disdain for the other. Some might be a little more tolerant. But it was certainly a significant issue, particularly when it came to the ideas of camaraderie or entertaining the idea of tolerance, and especially when it came to worship. Some Jews believe that Gentiles were actually created to fuel the fires of hell. Some even believe that you should not render aid to a Gentile woman giving birth because that would bring another heathen into the world. Gentiles were seen by some as idolaters and morally deviant. They were dogs in Jewish jargon. So with that being said, how do you think most Gentiles felt about Jews who held such views of them? Yeah, the love just flowed right back to them, right? Daggers were going both ways. And in thinking about our own racial tensions as well as these ancient racial tensions, while things like diversity training can be of some use, and hate legislation, which is absolutely necessary, but hate legislation can do some good with respect to protecting people, those interventions aren't always so great at changing people's hearts, right? Those remedies don't really bring about the dream that God has for different ethnic groups. Dr. King had a dream. Well, God has one as well. God wants racial peace and unity and has provided a means to those in his son Jesus. We might have passed some hate crime legislation that deters some violent behavior. God has a way to deal with hearts that have been infected by racism. And we, the church, carry him and his message within us. And so when we Christians drop the ball, it is especially bad. The solution for racial tension has been provided, and it's not in the Bill of Rights, although I'm a big fan of the Bill of Rights. We need that. It's not better police training, although we need that. It is in Jesus Christ. And the evidence of that truth should be seen in this multi-ethnic unity of Jesus' followers. Look at what Paul says in Ephesians. If you got your Bible there, I'm going to be in chapter 2, starting in verse 11. Paul says, "Remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth are called uncircumcised," which is kind of a little bit of a slam by the Jews there, by those who call themselves the circumcision. That's a little bit of an expression of superiority, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you, and again he's talking to the Gentiles, you Gentiles were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you, again, Gentiles, who once were far away, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. And here's a biggie. Verse 14, for he himself is our peace, who has made the two one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. Now you got to know that the temple, in the temple there in Jerusalem, there was a wall which actually separated the court of the Gentiles from the rest of the temple. And on that wall were inscriptions in both Latin and in Greek. And those inscriptions forbid Gentiles to enter. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus spoke about those inscriptions, and actually a couple of them have been found through some archaeological digs. And they read, no foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the sanctuary and enclosure. Anyone who is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his ensuing death. Paul says that Jesus has ripped this wall down. So Jews and Gentiles alike not only have equal access to God, they have spiritual unity as one. The ultimate answer to the problem of separation and alienation is reconciliation, both vertical with us and God and horizontal. And Jesus is the source for that. Pick up in verse 15. By setting aside in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations, his purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. And in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were once far away, and peace to you, those of you who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. So consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, this whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become what? A dwelling. And in the context, a multi-ethnic collective dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Dr. King had a dream. God has a dream as well. And God's dream is reconciliation. God says, I've made a way for reconciliation between myself and humanity, and reconciliation of one race to another. The answer is in my Son. And now, as Jesus followers, if you can consider yourself that, as Jesus followers, you and I are called to live that out through the power of his Spirit. And we need to really pursue that dream. We Jesus followers need to be a testimony to the world that when it comes to value, to privilege, to honor, to love, there is no Jew or Gentile, black or white. We need to be in the lead on this. We are intentionally committed to living out the reality that Jesus has already accomplished. In Jesus Christ, God's dream is reconciliation for those who've been separated by race or religion, creed or gender. And justice, as good and as important and as godly as justice is not reconciliation. Justice is about being fair, and we are certainly called to treat people fairly and stand against people being treated unfairly. And there's some room, definitely, for our country to grow in this area. But you can treat someone fairly and still not really have a heart for them. I remember a quote Kurt Vonnegut said a long time ago. He says, we can actually hate black people if we want to, so long as they have a fair shot at the American dream. Forget about the love and everything else. In a way, that's kind of what justice is, to be treated equally, to be treated fairly. But what Vonnegut is saying is that it's okay to hate on the inside as long as the rules are fair. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, hey, it's all about what's on the inside. It's all about your heart. To have hate in your heart is to be on a path toward murder. It's murder in utero. But justice, as good and godly as it is, it's still not reconciliation. And reconciliation is not separate but equal. And reconciliation is not tolerance, which is where I think a lot of people end up landing. We aren't simply to be able to coexist with each other. And that's not to say that we should be intolerant of people because of their race. But tolerance can be deceptive because it can kind of carry this illusion that things are okay when they may really not be. Love watching the Golden State Warriors, especially over the last handful of years. When Kevin Durant came to play with the Warriors, you kind of got this sense that Draymond Green and Kevin Durant tolerated each other. They both wanted to win. They wore the same uniform. They're on the same team. They sat on the same bench. But I wouldn't say that they were reconciled with each other. At best, I think they tolerated each other. And tolerance can fool us into thinking that everything's okay. Or, maybe worse, that there's nothing left for me to do to make things better. So we can have both justice and tolerance and still not have reconciliation, because justice and tolerance can be had without ever having to have relationship with someone. God is thinking reconciliation, intentional relationship, a love that pursues those who are different than us, and we sacrifice to tear down walls. So let me tell you some things that I think that God is wanting us to do right now. And I think he's been wanting these things for a long time. And I think it's just sort of kind of bubbling again to the surface here, given the events that are happening around us. And the first is this. He wants us to live like a reconciler. And there's a couple of items, I guess subsets of that. And the first one would be this, to wake up. And here's where things start to get, a little uncomfortable. We can't pretend that there isn't work left to be done in our community and in our own hearts. I think it's interesting that when we ask ourselves, Dave, do you ever struggle with greed? Yes. Do you ever struggle with lust or impure thoughts? Yes. Do you ever struggle with forgiveness? Yes. Do you ever struggle with anger? Sure. Do you ever struggle with racial prejudice? Oh, no. And I think maybe you're probably like that as well. That seems to be one that we don't want to really be open to considering personally. And I think just by default that if you are humble, you have to at some point realize that you aren't entirely like Jesus when it comes to racial issues. And I believe if you were born in this country, raised in this country, then you were born and raised into and breathed the air of a racially charged atmosphere. And hopefully you know that you have been affected by this. I know that it has affected me, and I have wrestled with this over the years. Let me give you a few snapshots of our situation. Go on any website and find some of this stuff. 10% of whites in our country are poor. 21% of blacks are poor. Why is that? Not one answer is going to explain the entirety of this, right? But racism is going to explain some of it. There's a thing out now that's actually called whitening your resume. If you have a name that sounds like something like Shakira or Tawanda or something like that, most people might think, that doesn't quite sound like a white name. They've done studies. This is a current study where they took multiple resumes and sent them to so many places across the country. And the resumes were identical in qualifications. And all they did was change the name to one, like a sort of a generic, vanilla, white sounding person's name, and then one that had more of an ethnic sounding name. The white name resumes had 2.5 times the responses of calls for interviews. That's a current study. Read an article this past week about Wilcox County, Georgia. The traditional experience there was to have, for the high school students, a white prom and a black prom. And there was 4 students that decided, 2 black, 2 were white, wanted to have an integrated prom. And you might think that that's a story out of the 50s or 60s, but this was 2018. So you do a little digging and you see that there was a statewide policy change in Georgia right about the same time that some of the civil rights legislation was being passed. And since schools were no longer going to be able to legally segregate, all proms in Georgia got reassigned to the private setting run by private citizens. So hence that led to white prom and black prom. That was the norm. These 4 students wanted to change that in their county. And for some reason, the governor would not support their efforts. But in a way, what's worse is that half of the school chose to go to the white prom. And this is not in the distant past. Now, that's not true of the entire state of Georgia. I actually called one of my nieces and had a really nice conversation with her yesterday evening about this. She grew up in the Atlanta area, and she said she would hear about it at various places in the state, but it wasn't a part of her experience growing up in high school there. But for that to even be an issue just seems so bizarre to me. When I was in graduate school in Texas, I had a friend, Major Boglin, and Major was black. We were both in the marriage and family program together. And a couple of times we would go out to the mall and walk around, maybe do a little bit of shopping. And invariably, when I would enter a store, I would be asked first if I needed any help. And sometimes I would say no, and they would just kind of then leave me alone unless I wanted to ask them for more help. Major would sometimes be asked if he needed help, and sometimes he would say no. But even if he said no, they would stand nearby him, just sort of watching him the entire time we were in the store. And if we were happen to, to try on some clothes, and I would go to the dressing room, I'd go in uninterrupted. But for Major, they would check and see, what are you taking in there? And waiting for him when he came out, do you still have the same things that you're bringing out? More than half of the U.S. servicemen of color in the United States Armed Forces in February of 2020 report experiencing racism while in the military. And it happens in so many different ways and to different degrees. I've heard it described by some of my black family and friends is like this damage of a thousand paper cuts. These little things just keep happening. And it's not just out there, though. I mean, sometimes it even happens in here. And if you do any neutral work about read about American church history and race relations, you can't get around this one. It's almost like it was one of the things that even Pentecostals and Church of Christers and Methodists could all agree on. We're going to have different worship places. So to live like a reconciler, we need to wake up and be honest with what's really going on. We also need to listen. Listen to more voices than the ones that already echo what you want to believe. Stretch yourself. Was jumping on Facebook for a little bit the other day, and I saw a post, and I loved it. I was so proud of Jessica Pollard. She said she was going to be reading a book called White Fragility. There's so many books that are out now, some of the top sellers on Amazon right now. And I'm sure that there might be some things as she reads through that book that she may end up rejecting. She just doesn't quite agree with the take on the author. But I'm betting that she might hear some eye-opening stuff as well. So keep reading and listening and talking to people who can bring you a different perspective. And so after we wake up and listen, I think we need to do the work of a reconciler. And a big part of that is that reconciliation requires relationship. And again, here's where we may squirm a little bit more, because relationships are built on honesty of what's really going on and how people are really feeling, and not dismissing that. Relationships are built on honesty and forthrightness and trust and goodwill. And to cultivate those in this issue, white people ultimately have to deal with guilt and responsibility. And we don't want to feel guilty. And it makes minorities also squirm a bit too, because minorities have to deal with their anger and responsibility. And it's going to require all of us to sacrifice, but that sounds very much like a Jesus thing, right? And so that's why, again, the church has to lead out in this. In these discussions over the years, sometimes I wish I had $1 for every time I heard someone say, well, I didn't own any slaves. I'm not burning crosses in people's yards. I'm not terrorizing minorities. And it's kind of a position that I think mistakenly thinks that because we haven't personally owned slaves, that we aren't mixed up in the problem. Newsflash, everybody knows that you didn't own slaves, right? And while that may be true factually, here's what I want you to think about this. What we are in effect doing is building a wall between ourselves and some people of another race. Jesus is tearing down walls, but statements like that, even unintentionally, they build walls. What they hear us saying is, don't involve me in this. I'm not responsible. This is your issue to work out. And when that is the message received, there's not much chance for reconciliation there. I think we are also so influenced by the idea of individual responsibility that it's difficult for us to deal with the concept of corporate responsibility, unless it's to our advantage. And what I mean by that is this, hang with me here. Take the idea of the colonists standing up to the British. We won't tolerate taxation without representation. We're going to be free. We want our people to be free. And you hear those sorts of things, and it makes you proud to be an American. You know, we like to be associated with that. We even say things like, we Americans weren't going to take that. We weren't going to take that oppression. Take the defeat of Hitler, the Berlin airlift, great things the U.S. was involved in as a nation. And even though you and your kids were not directly involved in that, we like to be associated with that. It makes you proud to be an American. And we draw near to that. And in some sense, we take ownership of that because this is our country. But when it comes to the American institution of slavery and racism and their legacies, we would rather just kind of deflect association with that. And that's every bit as much our history, and for a much longer stretch than some of those other things. And it's a living history. We are still dealing with this long reach that slavery has had, even into our present. And what would be helpful to our minority brothers and sisters is to own it. Name it for the sin that it is, for the great effects that it has had. And know that we may need to do that over and over as we develop our relationships with people of different races. Think about it this way. If your grandfather was a bigot, say he used degrading language about black people and he treated them as inferior, maybe even taught his dog to chase them, thinking that was pretty funny. If you were to one day by chance begin a relationship with the grandson of a man that your grandfather had treated so horribly, and this grandson were to tell you how hurtful that was to him, knowing what had happened to his grandfather, are you in the least way helpful to him and his healing by saying, well, that wasn't me? He knows that. Would it not bless his life and possibly open a door if you were to instead say how sorry you were that that happened and how can I help you? Go back and read through Nehemiah and read through Daniel and see how these men took personal responsibility for the sins that their people committed, even though they personally weren't even involved with them. If we will have more of this attitude and verbalize it, there might be a better chance for reconciliation. And I say chance because this really is a dance, right? And I believe minorities have their part to play in the dance as well. And their big and difficult part is forgiveness. As a minister in the DC area, Glenn Corain and his church really took seriously this message of Ephesians 2 and being one and reconciling. And they committed themselves toward racial reconciliation. And here's what he said, what some of the experience was like for him. He says, I found that when I admitted to these issues, there were some minorities very interested in increasing the guilt. Finding a white person finally willing to admit racism didn't always bring reconciliation. Sometimes it generated more blame. He says, I became a lightning rod for suppressed rage. The rage was genuine and merited. Blacks were very ready to admit their damage. They felt justified to withhold trust because they had been hurt so many times, and bitterness and anger seethed under the surface for many of them. But dumping on whites who want to change misses the mark. Black Christians must engage in the difficult work of forgiveness, knowing that it's going to be an ongoing work, and that's tough. Fred Gray, back to my book here. Several years ago, he was giving the Wallace Award for Courage. And this was in Alabama, and it's named after George Wallace in honor of his wife. George Wallace, a name that's equated with racism. And when we got him into a smaller audience up in Seattle and were able to have a discussion with him, sort of a roundtable, we asked him, how did you do that? And he said he could give it because George repented. So George Wallace came to me and asked for forgiveness. And somebody asked him, he said, wasn't it hard to forgive him? And Fred said, yes, but if I didn't, then I'm not a Christian. Forgiveness is not necessary to get some justice. Forgiveness isn't even necessary to arrive at some tolerance, but we can't get reconciliation without forgiveness being in the mix. And if I could kind of put all of this into sort of a bumper sticker admonition for us, it would be this: practice intentional incarnation. Be intentional about building relationships and friendships with someone from another race. Why? Because reconciliation comes through relationship. And isn't that how God reconciled you? Jesus practiced intentional incarnation. He didn't sit around and wait for us to make the first move. He didn't say, well, you guys are welcome in my neighborhood, and you're always welcome at my church. He went to where we are, here, and lived with us in order to bring about peace between us and God. Sometimes in marriage counseling, you'll have both individuals waiting to see who is going to make the first move toward healing. And if each waits for the other, a lot of times it just doesn't happen. Love makes the move. And so we need to be intentional about our relationships. We again asked Fred Gray, what started all of this for you? What put you on this path? He said, my mom took me to church and taught me about Jesus. So God's spirit in Fred and God's dream before him set him on this path that made our country better racially. I am so thankful for our church here in Walnut Creek. I am thankful for the diversity that we do have, for the love that's there. Let's keep leaning into this huge challenge, locked arm in arm together, locked arm in arm with each other, locked arm in arm with Jesus. And let's be a beacon, as we ought to be, of Jesus's ability to deal with this at the heart level. That is a message that will shine out to our community. Several years ago, I went to a Promise Keepers event in Portland, Oregon, and it was great. And the songs were great there. And as we get ready for communion, listen to the words from this song that the Promise Keepers worship team led us in here. God bless you guys.